35 Days at Sea. The 3 ships were over a week reaching the Canary Islands, where a month was spent repairing the Pinta's rudder and changing the sails on the Niña. It was September 6th when Columbus started on the actual voyage, which was to end 35 days later on October 12th. Each of those long days at sea had its hours marked by the proper prayers. Shortly after daybreak, the garment of the Santa Maria could be heard singing a prayer at the rising of the sun. Blessed be the light of day in the Lord of Verite. Blessed be the immortal soul in the Lord who keeps it whole. Blessed be the light of day in he who steals the night away. The day ended at sunset with another hymn in the words of the 91st Psalm. Each evening in his cabin, under a swinging lantern, Columbus wrote in his journal all the happenings of the day. Using this journal, Ferdinand later wrote a day-by-day account of the voyage in his book about his father, whom he always spoke of as the Admiral. The following entries are from Ferdinand's book. Sunday, September 9th. They completely lost sight of land, and many sighed and wept for fear that they would not see it again for a long time. The Admiral comforted them with great promises of land and riches. To dispel their fears, he decided to reckon less leagues than they actually made, that they might not think themselves at so great a distance from Spain, but for himself he kept a secret, accurate reckoning. Sunday, September 16th. They were surprised to see the surface of the water covered with a great mass of yellowish-green weed, which seemed to have been torn away from some island or reef. Many therefore affirmed that they must be near land, especially since they saw a live crab amid those mats of weed. Tuesday, September 18th. Martin Alonso Pinzon, who had gone ahead in the Pinta, a very fast sailor, lay to for the Admiral to come up, and informed him that he had seen a great flight of birds moving westward, and at sundown he thought he actually saw land to the north covered with darkness and clouds. All the ship's people wanted the Admiral to search in that direction, but he would not waste time upon it, because it was not the place where his calculations made him expect to find land. As this was the first voyage of that kind for all the men, they did not cease to grumble among themselves. Seeing nothing but water and sky, they paid the closest attention to all they observed, as was natural for men who had gone a greater distance from land than any had ever done before. Wednesday, September 19th. A pelican flew over the Admiral's ship, followed by others in the afternoon. This gave him hope, for he reflected that these birds would not have flown far from land. Thursday, September 20th. They saw more seaweed than ever before, stretching northward as far as they could see. It caused them great fright, lest the weed grow so thick as to hold the ships fast. Another fear was that the wind was always at their backs, and they would never have a wind for returning to Spain. The men grew even more restless and fearful. They met together in the holds of the ships, saying that the Admiral, in his mad fantasy, proposed to make himself a lord at the cost of their lives. Why then should they work to their own ruin by continuing that voyage? Others said that they had heard enough. If the Admiral would not turn back, they should heave him overboard and report in Spain that he had fallen in accidentally while observing the stars, and no one would question their story. The grumbling, lamenting, and plotting went on day after day, and at last the Admiral became aware of their wicked designs. Therefore, at times he addressed them with fair words. "Kitty, what are you doing? Itza, what do you want to learn about Columbus?" Does Itza want to learn about Columbus? Therefore, at times he addressed them with words very passionate, as if fearless of death. He threatened punishment to any who hindered the voyage. To bolster up their hopes, he reminded them of signs and tokens mentioned above, assuring them that they would soon sight land. Tuesday, September 25th. At sunset, while the admiral was talking with Pinzon, whose ship had come alongside, Pinzon suddenly cried out, "Land, land, sir! I claim the reward!" And he pointed to a bulk that clearly resembled an island. At this the people felt such joy and relief that they offered thanks to God. Next morning they knew that what they had supposed to be land was nothing more than squall clouds, which often resemble land. Wednesday, October 3rd. At sunrise, a week later, a pelican flew over the ship. Seeing no birds save some pardellas, the men feared that unknowingly they had passed between some islands. The admiral's people wished to turn off in another direction to look for these lands, but he refused because he feared to lose the fair wind that was carrying him due west along what he believed to be the most certain route to the Indies. The men were on the point of mutiny, grumbling and plotting against him. Sunday, October 7th. At daybreak they saw what appeared to be land lying westward, but since it was indistinct, none wished to claim having made the discovery for fear of losing 10,000 maravedis promised by the Catholic sovereigns to the first person sighting the land. In order to prevent men from crying, "Land, land," at every moment, the admiral ordered that one who claimed to have seen land and did not make good his claim in the space of 3 days would lose the reward. Monday, October 8th. There came to the ship 12 vari-colored birds of a kind that sing in the fields. They noted that the air was fresh and fragrant as April in Seville. But by this time the men's anxiety and desire to sight land had reached such a pitch that no sign of any kind would satisfy them. They did not cease to complain, nor the admiral to reprove them for their small spirit, telling them that for better or worse they must go through with the enterprise of the Indies on which the Catholic sovereigns had sent them. Thursday, October 11th. The flagship's people saw a cane or stick skillfully carved. The Nina's crew saw a thorn branch loaded with red berries that seemed to be freshly cut. These signs and his own reasoning convinced the admiral that land must be near. That night, therefore, after they had sung the evening hymn, he spoke to the men of the favor that our Lord had shown them by conducting them to safety. About 2 hours before midnight, as the admiral stood in the stern castle, he saw a light, but says it was so uncertain a thing that he dared not announce it was land. Friday, October 12th. About 2 hours after midnight, the Pinta, a speedy sailor that ranged far ahead, fired the signal for land. At daybreak they saw an island. As soon as they had cast anchor, the admiral went ashore in an armed boat, displaying the royal standard. The captains of the other 2 ships did the same. After all had rendered thanks to our Lord, kneeling on the ground and kissing it with tears of joy for his great favor to them, the admiral rose and gave this island the name of San Salvador. And, sad to say, Columbus could not resist taking the reward for himself, and so planted a seed of resentment in the heart of the Pinta's captain, Martin Alonso Pinzon, that was to bear bitter fruit. Where were they? Guanahani is what the islanders called the island which Columbus christened San Salvador. Since this island, according to his calculations, must be one of the East Indies, he naturally called the natives Indians. Actually, these so-called Indians were a gentle, peaceful tribe who called themselves Taínos. At the sight of the ships, they had come running to the shore to see what kind of huge bird had flown in from the sea, and what strange people they seemed. Men with white skin, what there was to see of it. Their bodies were covered with cloth, their faces with bushy hair, almost up to their eyes. Columbus presented gifts to the Taínos, and they were friendly and happy with the gifts, hanging the blue glass beads about their necks. In return, they gave freely of everything they had. Later, when the Spaniards had gone back to the ships, some came swimming out, bringing parrots, skeins of cotton thread, and darts. Others paddled out in boats made of hollowed-out tree trunks, some of which were large enough to hold 40 men. All day Saturday, October 13th, the Niña, Pinta, and the Santa Maria lay at anchor with seamen rowing ashore in their small boats and Indians paddling back and forth in their dugouts, all trying to make themselves understood by signs and gestures. The Taínos repeated the Spanish words they heard very quickly, and Columbus noted in his journal that he thought they could be easily made into good servants. It did not occur to Columbus that the Taíno people were free, with no desire to become servants. The next day, Sunday, taking 3 small boats, Columbus and some of his men rowed north along the shore, where they saw several small villages, but nothing to suggest Japan, which he knew would be a much larger island than San Salvador, and from all his calculations should lie to the southwest. By signs and gestures, he tried to ask the natives if they knew of such an island. They nodded and smiled and pointed. "Cuba," they said, "Cuba." They stretched their arms wide to suggest an island much larger than their own. Since they pointed in the right direction, it seemed possible that what they called Cuba might be Cipango, Marco Polo's name for Japan. The admiral wrote in his journal that night that he was going from Japan without delay to the mainland of China to present his letter of introduction to the Grand Khan. "All I have to do now is to look for gold and spices." Monday, the Santa Maria, followed by the Niña and the Pinta, set off for Cuba, with 6 Indians aboard to act as guides. They were 2 weeks on the way, winding in and out among the many smaller islands, each seeming lovelier than the last. Here and there Columbus sent men ashore to look about for gold and spices. They found none, but brought back other items of interest. On one island they saw swinging beds made of coarsely woven cloth, which the natives called hamacas. These hammocks were so comfortable that the Spaniards later adopted them for use by sailors on shipboard. Trees and flowers on all the islands were so strangely beautiful, so unlike those in Spain, that Columbus declared that his eyes never tired of looking at them. But he added, "I believe there are many trees and plants which are worth a lot in Spain for dyes and medicines of spicery, but I do not recognize them, which gives me great grief." Pepper would have been the greatest find, but any of the spices were so rare in Europe as to be almost as good as gold. Nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger were weighed in apothecary shops with all the windows closed, so that none of the precious powder would blow away. Although the Spaniards, who had never seen spices growing, would not have recognized them, there was not a man among them who was not certain that he could recognize gold. And gold was what Columbus must find and take back to Spain. That alone would be proof that he had reached Cipango, where Marco Polo said that temples and palaces were roofed in solid gold. It was daybreak on October 28th. On the Santa Maria, They had just finished singing the daily prayer to the dawn as, soft and hazy, the nearby shores of Cuba were coming into view. The sun rose high, the sea sparkled, and 3 ships with their great square sails dropped anchor in a beautiful bay. Columbus went ashore in the first of several small boats and said he had never beheld so fair a place. But if this fair place was Japan, why was there no city here? The shore was deserted. Nothing was to be seen but a few huts, some palm fiber fishing nets, and 1 or 2 strange-looking yellow dogs that did not bark. Next morning, on another bay to the west, the explorers found a large native village made of tents, pointed like those in a Moorish camp, each with a smoke pipe rising from the point. While the Spaniards searched the village for gold, the 6 Indian guides whom Columbus had brought from San Salvador talked with the people who were also Taínos. But as yet they did not know enough Spanish to translate what they heard, so it was necessary for all to fall back on signs and gestures. Touching a chain, a cross, or some other object made of gold, Columbus tried to show that gold was what he hoped to find. The natives, eager to please, nodded and pointed inland, repeating the word Cubanacan, which was their word for central Cuba. Cubanacan. That sounded to Columbus like El Gran Khan, the Spanish words meaning the Grand Khan. It did not seem possible that they were already in or near the empire of the Great Khan, yet when he made gestures indicating a mighty ruler, the Cubans nodded again and pointed to the center of their island. This was no mistake. Their great chief, Arcacake, did live in Cubanacan. Columbus was puzzled. Instead of being in Japan, was he on the mainland of China? It seemed unlikely. Yet, who could say? To be on the safe side, he appointed an embassy of 4 men to investigate, headed by Luis de Torres, the interpreter, who carried the letter of introduction from Ferdinand and Isabella, and also a royal gift for the Grand Khan. While they were away, Columbus and the 2 Pinzon brothers, Martin, Alonso, and Vicente, did some exploring up the river, eagerly searching for gold. Martin Alonso even more so than the others. He found some native peppers. Columbus tasted sweet potatoes, and all 3 saw cotton growing for the first time. For a short while, Martin Alonso mistook something he found for cinnamon, but his vision of making a fortune in spices soon faded away. So far, to his way of thinking, the voyage was a failure. He was a merchant seaman, not an explorer, as his brother was inclined to be, nor waste time admiring scenery like this so-called Admiral Columbus. The 4 ambassadors to the Great Khan were back a day earlier than expected, with nothing to report except that they had found a village of palm leaf huts and a few hundred very friendly natives who, the Spaniards soon discovered, had a most surprising custom. Men and women drank the smoke of an herb, which they twisted into a roll small enough to stick into one nostril. Then it was lighted, and they drew in the smoke. The rolled herbs were called tobacos. The ambassadors, as men from heaven, had been shown great honor and hospitality, and in return they had brought back the chief and his son to be entertained aboard the Niña or the Pinta. The Santa Maria was then high and dry, having her hull cleaned and scraped, and being made ready to sail farther on in search of gold. By signs and gestures, the natives indicated that to the north of Cuba was an island where gold was so plentiful that it could be scooped up on the beach. When the Santa Maria was afloat again and ready to leave for this island of gold, Columbus repaid the kindness of the islanders by having 5 friendly young Taínos who had come aboard for a final visit seized and held by force to be carried off to Spain. The wind changed so suddenly after the 3 ships sailed from Cuba that Columbus gave orders to return. He was obeyed by Vicente Pinzon in the Niña, but the speedy Pinta kept steadily on its way. Martin Alonso was sick of slowing down for the stodgy flagship. He was also fed up with taking orders from that Genoese admiral who had cheated him out of his reward for being first to see land. He was going to be the first to find gold, if at any rate there was any gold to be found. Columbus was distressed that his senior captain should have deserted without his permission or desire, as he wrote that night in his journal, as well as by many other things he has done and said to me. The fact remained, however, that Martin Alonso Pinzon was gone, and nothing more was to be seen of him or the speedy Pinta until after the middle of January. Christmas on Haiti. The first Christmas in the New World was celebrated by Columbus and his Spaniards on the island of Haiti. There, the first gold was to be discovered and the first Spanish settlement established. Crossing the windward passage from Cuba, the 2 ships, the Niña and the Santa Maria, reached a harbor at the western end on December 5th. As this was the eve of the feast of St. Nicholas, Columbus named the harbor Puerto de San Nicolas. Haiti itself seemed so similar to Spain that he called it the Spanish island, La Isla Española. Hispaniola, the Latin form which Peter Martyr was to use, is still the island's name. The gentle Taínos whom Columbus had carried with him from their home islands were panic-stricken as they neared the island of Haiti. When the ships anchored and others went ashore, they remained huddled together below deck, shaking with terror for fear of being killed and eaten. They believed that Haiti was the home of their enemies, the fierce man-eating Caribs, or Cannibals, who often raided their islands. This was a mistake. More of the same gentle Taínos were found to be living on Haiti, but the poor fearful passengers refused to believe it, until one day sailors who had gone ashore captured a very beautiful young girl. They brought her aboard the Santa Maria, and she talked to the other Taínos. Delighted with her visit, she hated to leave, but eventually went off, enveloped in a huge sailor shirt which Columbus had given her. Her father was a young cacique, who told about an older, more powerful cacique, whose name was Guacanagiri, and who ruled over all the northwest end of Haiti. Columbus soon sent messengers in a small boat with islanders to guide them to Guacanagari's village. They returned full of praise for the chieftain, who had given them many presents and wished to meet their admiral. Best of all, they brought the great news that there was gold, great quantities of gold, to be found somewhere on this island. It was now December 23rd. All agreed that they should spend Christmas with Guacanagari. On Christmas Eve, the 2 ships were sailing slowly toward a large bay from which narrow channels winding through a mangrove swamp led to Guacanagari's village. The sea was quiet. There was little wind. The master of the Santa Maria, who was on watch, got so sleepy that he turned the job over to the grumman. The young boy, holding the clumsy tiller, was the only one awake when the ship slid quietly onto a coral reef. He felt the rudder scrape, and he cried out for help. Columbus woke with a start, rushed to the deck, followed by the guilty master. "Take one of the boats," Columbus told him. "Get an anchor and cable and try to pull the ship back into deep water." It might have been possible to ease the Santa Maria gently off the rocks before too much damage was done, if the master had obeyed orders. Instead, he jumped into the small boat with some of his cronies and pulled away toward the Niña. Vicente Pinzon, the Niña's loyal captain, refused to take them aboard. He sent them back, and also sent his one rowboat to help Columbus. By then it was too late to save the Santa Maria. The coral reef had punched large holes in her wooden hull. It was filling with water, and she had to be abandoned, while Columbus and his crew of 40 men crowded onto the little Niña. Christmas morning at daybreak, Columbus sent Diego de Arana and another sailor to Guacanagari to ask for help. By the time the sun was high, the chief had all of his canoes and many of his people at work carrying cargo and gear ashore, while he and his brothers kept careful watch that nothing should be stolen. Columbus, sick at heart, directed operations from the deck of the Niña. From time to time, Guacanagari sent one of his relatives to the weeping admiral to console him, telling him that he must not be troubled or annoyed, and that he would give him whatever he had. The next day, a large canoe was being paddled out to the Niña, bringing Guacanagari to himself to meet the admiral, who presented his guest with a shirt and a pair of gloves and invited him to dinner. The old chieftain told the admiral there was gold, as much gold as he could want, in a part of his island called Cibao. A day or so later, Guacanagari entertained the admiral on shore at dinner, at which he served yams, broiled lobsters, and cassava bread. Guacanagari spoke to his guest about the Caribs, his fierce enemies, a fearful man-eating tribe, and of their awful bows and arrows. He and his tenos had no weapons, as the admiral could see, nothing but darts for spearing fish. Columbus quickly sent to the ship for the strong Turkish bows and put on an exhibition of target shooting. This was followed by some musket shots, even more amazing to the chieftain. What were Carib bows and arrows compared to these deadly weapons? This powerful white man, the chieftain told himself, was a friend worth having. For his powerful new friend, Guacanagari now brought forth a gift which he knew would please him. It was a mask which had eyes and ears that were made of gold. That night the thought struck Columbus that his prayer had been answered. It may have been as he was writing in his journal, with the mask gleaming in the light of his lantern, that he suddenly saw the shipwreck as an act of God, a blessing in disguise. Not only guiding him to the gold, God had also shown him the place to build a fort, and what to use, the planks and timbers of the Santa Maria. Once more he was full of hope and spirit, convincing himself that he was truly Christopher, servant of the Lord. Morning came. Under his orders, the men set to work at once, laying out and planning the fort. With the natives doing all the heavy lifting and hard work, it was completed in a few days. Since the wreck had occurred on Christmas Eve, Columbus called the fort La Navidad, or the Nativity. There was no problem to get 40 volunteers to remain in the fort instead of returning to Spain. More than enough clamored to stay and be first to find the gold mine. Diego de Arana was left in command of the 40 chosen to stay. The others, more or less envious, bade them farewell and rowed out to the Niña, now ready to leave for home with news of the great discovery. Columbus intended to sail at top speed for fear that Martin Alonso Pinzon might be on the way. In the speedier Pinta, he could easily reach Spain first and claim all the glory and the reward, instead of being punished for desertion. Before the Niña had gone far, the lookout on the top mast spotted a ship, And there, by San Fernando, was the Pinta, sailing towards them. Soon Martin Alonso had come aboard, with various unbelievable excuses for his absence. Columbus, inclined to prefer peace at any price, accepted the explanation without argument. So they set out together, the two ships, the Nina and the Pinta, to make the stormy winter journey home across the Atlantic, leaving behind the old Santa Maria converted into Fort La Navidad.